One thing to really understand for the Middle Ages is their system of classes and political system. So it was both a political and social system during the Middle Ages, and that was known as feudalism, right? And this is the way that not only the government in a way worked, but also the way that society functioned and where everybody fit into society. And this image here really kind of explains feudalism at its best. And it is to be considered like a pyramid in a sense, right? At the very top, you have the king, right? At that time, the king had absolute power over their land, whatever country it was, all over Europe had this same type of feudal society. So the king, because he was in charge, controlled everything. That means he owned all the land. And he gave an area of land to those who he believed, right, were his friends, family, those who helped him before. He gave them a piece of land that was known as a fief, right? And these were given to those lords and nobles. In exchange for the land that the king has given them, those lords and nobles had to provide the king with soldiers, right? Soldiers and horses and an army practically for the king to have, right? So that was the agreement. The king gives them land. The nobles in exchange have to provide the king with an army, with a number of soldiers. Now, in order for these lords and nobles, which were known as vassals, right, because they served the king, these were vassals to the king. These lords and nobles now had to find, okay, where do I get this army? So what they did was that they took this huge piece of land that the king gave them, and they broke it up into smaller portions. And they began to give these lands to professional soldiers, to those who would serve as soldiers for the king later on, right? So in exchange for being able to live on the Lord's land, those professional soldiers had to then pledge their service to that Lord, who then would provide those soldiers to the king if ever in need, right? And these soldiers were known at that time as knights, right? And so these became vassals to the lords, right? The lords were vassals to the king, and now the knights are vassals to the lords because the knights owe the lords for being able to live on their land. Now, besides the knights, we also had peasants because we needed to have people to actually work the land, right? You needed peasants to be able to farm the land, to be able to tend to the different livestock on the land, those who were there to be able to take care of the homes and servants in the homes. So all of these peasants worked the land for the nobles and the knights, who in return allowed them to live on the land and offered them protection, right? They were safe within the fief or the fiefdom of that particular lord. Because if not, then the peasants would be stuck out in the middle of nowhere in the country all alone, open to attack and unprotected. So in exchange for being part of this fief, right, being part of this area, then the peasants were then protected by the lord and the knights, and in exchange had to provide their service, whatever it was, whether it was farming the land, whether it was then working in the house, whether it was the fact that they had to pay a small portion of rent if they got paid, or portions of food that they grew that they were able to keep some for themselves, but the rest went to the knights or the vassals. So you see here, the system of feudalism in the Middle Ages was this give and take system, right? It was a system based on agreements. The king with the lords with the king, then the lords with the knights, and then the knights with the lords, and then finally the peasants with the knights and the peasants with the lords as well. So at the very bottom, of course, you had the peasants, who were also sometimes known as serfs, right? And that, of course, was the lowest part of our feudal system and the largest part of our feudal system as well, right? That was the majority of people kind of fell under this peasant category. And this was the way that the Middle Ages or medieval society was structured, right? This was the same type of class system that you found throughout the majority of Europe at this time.